Were there actually some integrated units during the American Civil War? So one of the things that I love most about diving into primary records is the infinite rabbit holes that you can go down when going through those records. The most recent example of this is a story of a black undercook who seemingly was in a combat role riding right alongside his white counterparts in the 11th Kansas Cavalry. So we first made this discovery when we were researching an anonymous note found on the prairie the day after the Battle of Platte Bridge on July 26th of 1865. What we were originally researching is that note found on the battlefield that was written from an unknown captured soldier who stated the following. Blackfeet, Cheyenne, Arapaho, Sioux, a few Comanches are still here now. They want to fight 4 days more. I was taken prisoner down on the Platte River. You killed a chief yesterday evening. They say they do not want to have peace. There is over 1,000 of them come. They want all to leave tonight. They are moving to pull up all there. No signature. So one of the things that was interesting about this note is that it was a captured individual that was captured the day before on a battle, and yet it was a signature unknown, and the soldiers at the time had no idea who it was, which blew me away, which is why we're doing this research, is how can you lose someone and someone writes a note who is a POW with the Indians, and he wrote this, said, hey, he wants to kill you, I've been taken prisoner, no signature, left in the battlefield, and they have no idea who he is. So we were doing research to try to figure out who was missing and who is it? We have no idea, right? So we were looking at one of the descriptive books found with the 11th Kansas Cavalry and found an awesome piece of forgotten history. What was on this descriptive roll? Well, at the bottom of the page, a man by the name of Harvey Craven was listed as a black or colored undercook, 18 years of age, 5'7", black eyes, black-haired young man who had enlisted in the 11th Kansas Cavalry in December 13th of 1864. But what was most surprising is the remarks on his individual record, and it stated the following. Was in battle with Indians at Reshaw Bridge, July 2nd, 1865. Was in battle with Indians at Platte Bridge, July 25th, 1865. Was wounded severely in battle with Indians at Platte Bridge on July 26th, 1865. It was at this moment that I knew we had something pretty unique and something rare. Not the fact that black soldiers were in combat, not the fact that soldiers were out west getting killed by Indians, not that, but what struck me as odd was what we already knew about these battles. And when you add the context that a black undercook was involved with these battles, also fighting and being severely wounded, it actually paints a different story than what most may interpret. Those battles listed in which this 18-year-old undercook took part in were not battles fought on campaign where Harvey might have been involved riding along campaign and just got caught up in what was going on. They were not an overnight battle in which they could have an excuse to have maybe bring along staff, officers, or other support personnel like in which Harvey Craven would have been involved with. These battles that they had with Indians on July 2nd and July 25th were very quick, out and back running gun battles in which those who participated knew it would only be a few miles in, a few miles out, and a few miles back for the purposes of engaging the hostiles to chase them away from the telegraph line. So what this means and why this is significant is that if he was on a patrol with a quick mission that everyone knew was likely to result in a running gun battle a few miles out and a few miles back, riding alongside his white counterparts, then by definition, this cavalry regiment would be acting as a pseudo-integrated regiment. Yeah, I know. I'm not saying that the 11th Kansas was officially an integrated unit. As we all know that the military wasn't officially integrated until 1948, some 3 years after World War II. And I'm also not saying that it's rare for black soldiers to have been in combat roles during this time of history. Of course, we have many black regiments in the 1860s, especially the American Civil War. Of course, the 54th Massachusetts, made famous by the movie Glory. We also had 120 plus USCT regiments as well. What I'm saying is that a black undercook purposely riding on a combat patrol and participating in known running gun battles right alongside his white counterparts is something noteworthy. It may not be, something that never happened, but it's definitely noteworthy, and his story definitely needs to be told. So in order to tell his story, at least fully, we have to start back at the beginning for us to really truly appreciate this situation. Because in order to prove that this actually happened, we have to address a few key points here. So point number one, was Harvey Craven actually fighting in a battle with a primary combat role, or was he just with his regiment riding alongside his column when he found himself fighting for his life alongside everyone else and just was engaged in the enemy just because he happened to be there? Or another way of saying this is, was Harvey Craven fighting out of just survival or actually out of choice in a combat role? So point number two, would the leadership or commanding officers of the 11th Kansas Cavalry even allow something like this? So we're going to take a look at who were the commanding officers and how do they feel about black soldiers, black troopers, or African Americans in general. And point number three is, are there any other supporting evidence that may suggest that black soldiers or black, quote, undercooks were actually in a combat role in the 11th Kansas Cavalry, not just here, but throughout the history of the regiment? So as a quick history of the 11th Kansas Cavalry, they were organized at Camp Lyon, Kansas in September 1862. Interestingly enough, it was originally organized as an infantry unit. They fought at Fort Wayne, Prairie Grove, and against Quantrell's Raiders in Kansas in August of 1863. In April of 1865, they were sent west along the Oregon Trail to Fort Laramie, Platte Bridge, and Fort Halleck. What this means is that by the time they came out west, and I mean way west, they were actually an experienced veteran regiment. Even published their own newspaper, albeit only kind of once, called the Buck and Ball, named after their issue weapons at the time, which was the Potsdam large caliber musket, which shot a buck and ball cartridge. At least that's the ones that they had. So by the time they came out west to fight Indians and maintain the telegraph line, they had been issued the Smith carbine. Now, if you don't know much about the Smith carbine, we did a video on it a while back, so go ahead and click up here to watch that video if you wish. But either way, the ordnance returns of the 11th Kansas Cavalry, along with a lot of other regiments, shows a mishmash from company to company of a wide variety of weapons. By the time they get mustered out, they had fought basically the entirety of the American Civil War out west, and then were sent along the overland trails to fight Indians and maintain the telegraph line, ironically in one of the bloodiest summers on record up until that point. The regiment lost a total of 173 men, 61 enlisted, and 2 officers were killed or wounded in battle, 27 of which were lost on a single day at a small outpost called Platte Bridge Station. Once we ran across the record of Harvey Craven, who definitely isn't shy to get into a scrape or two, we wanted to see how much we could find on this actual individual. Of course, Ancestry has his military records, and we found a couple newspaper clippings, but we really weren't able to find much on this infamous or famous soldier of the 11th Kansas Cavalry. In fact, most of the other sources we found just repeated the same amazing fact that he had fought Indians on 3 separate instances, and the last one in which he was severely wounded, actually just behind me on this bridge. Now, one thing to note is we honestly didn't look at previous records from other regiments, north or south, in which he might have been a cook for them as well, because again, he didn't enlist in the 11th Kansas Cavalry until 1864, so there's definitely a history before that where he may have also done a few other duties for different regiments. But that's the fun of these historic rabbit trails, is there is a bunch of digging that we can still do and find out who Harvey Craven actually was. Maybe his name appears in other regimental records. So the premise that we were trying to set out and prove is that this young black man who was listed as an undercook, not a soldier, was actually performing regular duties as a combat soldier in a knowingly combative role, riding alongside his white counterparts, thus qualifying the 11th Kansas Cavalry as a, quote, integrated unit back in 1865, of course, although not officially. So let's go ahead and dive into the first battle that he was listed in, participating in July of 1865. So on July 2nd, Sioux warriors were harassing Platte Bridge Station, cutting the telegraph line and shooting at the fort. So Captain Greer from the 11th Kansas Cavalry chose 10 men that were sent out specifically to chase off those Indians and protect the telegraph and repair the telegraph if needed. So after saddling up and leaving Platte Bridge Station here, going the direction that is directly behind me, they chased him for about 5 or 6 miles to the old Rishaw or Rishaw Bridge. they found themselves confronted by superior numbers, in which case the mounted detail had to fight their way back. In fact, one soldier had a brush with death when a bullet whizzed by and clipped his ear as they were galloping away. So according to these records, Harvey Craven was one of these 10 men who was sent out on a known seek and destroy mission to chase off hostile Indians and return back to the fort that same day. This wasn't an overnight campaign or extended ride. The 10 men who came out clearly knew that they were going on a quick back and forth mission that would result probably in a running gun battle. Then the second battle that Harvey was listed and fighting in was July 25th of 1865. On that morning, soldiers noticed about 20 warriors on the bluffs north of the fort, and so the soldiers began to run towards the bridge and engage the warriors to the north. After engaging them and fighting with them, a little while later, they actually saw about 50 warriors that had actually swam the river with their horses, got on the south side where the fort is, which is actually just right behind me. They would have seen those 50 Indians. So at this point, the soldiers fell back closer to the confines of the fort to prevent them from getting cut off from safety. It was after this point that the Indians actually started going not after the soldiers, but started chasing off the beef herd that was just to the east of here. So once again, poor Captain Greer was sent out to chase off the Indians and this time protect the beef herd. And as the soldiers approached the beef herd and the Indians that were actually trying to chase them off, the soldiers started engaging and those Indians started kind of getting pushed back and kind of withdrawing from that area. So after falling back a little bit, the Indians actually started doing charges or fronts to the soldiers. And at one of these charges, Chief Highback Wolf was shot through the gut, but he managed to kind of hang on, go to a thick of brush, and he fell off in the brush after he thought he was in safety. 2 Kansas Cavalry soldiers came after or chased after Highback Wolf and caught up to him where he fell off. Assuming that he was dead, these soldiers, wanting to make sure, stabbed him directly through the heart while the chief lay down, seemingly dead. Now, I was really interested as far as research rabbit holes I was going down into. All the reports and letters say is stabbed him in the heart. I don't know if it's with the sabers or with a knife or something else. I was kind of curious. We do have evidence that by this time, the 11th Kansas Cavalry and I believe the 11th Ohio, although don't quote me on that, had already taken their sabers off. They were in the ordnance stores here. They weren't wearing them on a daily, regular basis. So it was unlikely that they actually stabbed him with a saber. I'm leaning toward a knife, mainly because of other primary records that we found where they weren't riding with their sabers during the summer of 1865. So the chief didn't move when the soldiers stabbed him, and being satisfied that he was dead, and once realizing that this famous chief who had mutilated a fellow soldier previously not long ago, the soldiers actually proceeded to try to scalp the chief at this time. When they started this process, Highback Wolf woke up, or I guess came to life, and started fighting back, and then later kind of pleaded for his life, then fought back and pleaded for his life. And either way, right away, the soldiers went ahead and shot him in the head, in which case he was actually dead. And after all of this is happening, the Indians charging and feinting and charging and then falling back, they left. Captain Greer and his detail of men had chased off those Indians. Unfortunately, one steer was shot and killed in this whole melee. So the soldiers actually did the right, sensible thing, drug it back to the fort and ate that for rations that night. So again, going back to the primary records, this detail of cavalry troopers were sent off to fight Indians, save the beef herd, and protect the telegraph line. It was not an extended campaign. It wasn't an overnight thing or even an all-day thing. It was an out-and-back thing that was, again, knowingly going to result in a running gun battle. And who was with them, riding alongside in the thick of it? Undercook Harvey Craven. Lastly, the third battle that's mentioned that Harvey Craven was in and, quote, severely wounded was the famous Battle of Platte Bridge, which actually happened on July 26th, that's the very next day of 1865. Now, those of you who don't know about the Battle of Platte Bridge in Red Buttes, the gist of it is that there was a wagon train coming from Sweetwater Station just actually that way, about 40 miles from here to the west. Wagon train was coming back from delivering supplies to Sweetwater Station, going past Independence Rock, and they were supposed to be here the morning of July 26th. About midnight, some other troopers kind of traveling at night came, woke up the commanding major, Major Anderson, who was here, and said, hey, the wagon is holed up. They need to come here. They're going to be attacked by Indians. They're all over the place. We need to make sure they're safely escorted. At the time, Major Anderson didn't send a detail, but waited until the morning. That morning, they woke up the whole fort right here. They saw Native Americans across the bridge, across on the bluffs over there, and knowing that the wagon train was supposed to actually come over at any moment now, because they were just a few miles to the west of here, Major Anderson actually detailed Casper Collins with the 11th Ohio Cavalry to lead Kansas soldiers, the 11th Kansas Cavalry, to go out across the bridge, cut west, hook up with the wagon train, and safely escort them back to the fort. Those Indians that were on the bluffs kind of drew them out of the fort, and when Casper Collins and his 25 or 26 some men got a little ways from the fort, started just surrounding him, coming over the bluffs, just about a quarter mile or a mile away from here. At that time, it was about 1,500 Indians, significantly more than the 20-something soldiers that Casper Collins had, and they surrounded Casper Collins. Some Indians that were alongside the river started cutting off his route of retreat. There were other Native Americans that were actually east of here along what was now called Casper Creek, where Casper Collins' body was eventually found, started coming in from the east, and again, effectively surrounding Casper Collins and his detail. It was at this point in time that soldiers here at the fort started going across the bridge that I was at the beginning of this video and started engaging the Native Americans on the other side of the bridge to try to open up a hole for those for Casper Collins and his troopers to come by. At that time, the soldiers mounted were just running as fast as they can. They hit a wall of the Indians, the warriors. It was a melee, and pretty much almost every soldier from that detail made it across the bridge, other than a handful that was killed in the engagement, one of which was Casper Collins from the 11th Ohio Cavalry. His body was found the next day with dozens of arrows in his body, of course mutilated, and that's why Platte Bridge Station was later renamed Fort Casper. So regarding Harvey Craven and where he was on the 26th is a little bit more complicated than the previous two battles, because on July 2nd, there was a detail of 10 men that went out, fought, and came back. On July 25th, there was a detail, specifically again with Captain Greer, went out, fought him, came back. On July 26th, you have the detail of 25-ish men, soldiers, going across the bridge and getting engaged with the Native Americans on the other side of the bridge. You also have the soldiers that had run across the bridge and engaged the Native Americans on foot on the other side of the bridge to help keep Casper Collins and his detail a little bit safer, to try to, hook up with the wagon train out further west. So we don't really know exactly whether Harvey Craven was mounted or dismounted, whether he was dismounted with, you have Sergeant Brettney here, who was with the dismounted detail, I believe. Casper Collins going out west. The point is that Harvey Craven was in a role in which he got severely wounded in this battle. Now, based on where the dismounts were versus where the mounted detail of Casper Collins was, I'm inclined to think Harvey Craven was with the mounted detail riding across to try to hook up with the wagon train, although I can't prove it. It doesn't matter. What matters is that Harvey Craven clearly was either volunteered or was willing to go in combat roles, because his normal role as an undercook, he could totally have an excuse not to go on these details. Even more important than that, the fort here, Platte Bridge Station, was so low on ammo that you had soldiers actually making their own bullets, casting their own bullets, making their own cartridges here at the fort, because they thought for sure they were going to get overrun. Why not give Harvey Craven that work, that detail to make bullets while the, quote, white soldiers fight? Again, this is clear indication that whether he was voluntold, whether he actually volunteered, either way, it doesn't matter. Harvey Craven was clearly willing to fight alongside his white counterparts on the 2nd, the 25th, and the 26th, which again resulted in a severe wounding to Harvey Craven. So then back to our premise that Harvey Craven was allowed to ride as a mounted trooper alongside his white counterparts in a clearly combative role has to be supported with these three battles that he was in. Thus, he clearly gained some combat experience in the summer of 1865. So with the supporting evidence that Mr. Craven was clearly functioning in a combative role, the question comes up on the leadership of the regiment. Who was leading the regiment, and would they even allow black soldiers to fight alongside the rest of the regiment as, quote, equals? I mean, at this time in history, African Americans could not hold a combatant role within a, quote, white regiment. All they could do, officially at least, was hold job-related tasks like being a cook or undercook. So regarding this leadership question, the short answer is yes. The 11th Kansas Cavalry was littered with multiple examples of men who participated quite intimately in bleeding Kansas before the war even broke out. So while there's dozens of examples, I'm going to focus on top leadership and the leadership that was here in July of 1865, and that kind of sets the tone for the rest of the regiment. And those men are Major Martin Anderson and Preston B. Plum. First, let's talk about the Lieutenant Colonel of 11th Kansas, who was Preston B. Plum. This guy was absolutely amazing and is the example of a fair and honest man. In fact, if you want to learn about this forgotten senator, yes, senator later on after the war, go ahead and check out The Forgotten Senator by Joanna Wickman. It's an awesome book that details his life during the war and after the war. It's quite amazing from the 11th Kansas or just Kansas history perspective. So as a young man in bleeding Kansas, he actually purchased with his own money a Kansas newspaper for the explicit purpose of publishing anti-slavery or pro-abolition agendas. He met John Brown, in which lit his passion to do more. And of course, I'm sure we all know meeting John Brown in person would definitely be either a zeal booster or just an experience altogether, I'm sure. He actually smuggled guns and other weapons in from other states into Kansas and actually led a Kansas company called the Grizzlies in a military combat skill exercise. And he actually led these Grizzlies in a detachment from Iowa City down to Topeka, Kansas, and put down mutinies across state lines. So Preston Plum definitely believed in abolition, believed in a free state of Kansas, and was willing to fight for it to the point that, again, in multiple cases, he came close with death. So secondly, let's talk about Major Martin Anderson, who was the commanding officer on the 25th and 26th of July when they had one of the two largest battles here in 1865. This guy also was a staunch abolitionist who almost died for the free state of Kansas. On March 12th, 1859, Martin Anderson organized a pro-abolitionist meeting, and after this meeting, pro-slavery rioters attacked the attendees of the meeting, including Martin Anderson, and hit him over the head with a 3-foot-long, thick oak stick. Now, great, it sounds fine, get hit by a stick, no big deal, right? No. Anderson was immediately knocked unconscious, fell to the ground, at which point the rioter emptied an entire revolver into the lifeless corpse of Major Martin Anderson. And after all that, he woke up 4 days later. So imagine that. You get hit with a stick and you wake up 4 days later in bed. That's not just being knocked out. That's what we call being in a coma. And requiring those amount of days to just wake up, it took him 3 weeks until he was well enough to head back home, and honestly 6 months before he could return back to work. Friends and family even stated that he really never fully recovered from that blow to the head. And even after all of this, Major Anderson was even more of a free stater and kept his zeal for that right for African Americans to stay free. So after all of that, the reason I bring this up is to show that the leadership of the 11th Kansas Cavalry, just from the top level, including the lieutenant colonel, down to the commanding officer level here at the fort on the day these battles actually took place, is that leadership very much would have allowed African Americans or black soldiers, even if they were listed as, quote, cooks or undercooks, to ride alongside their white counterparts if they wanted to in a combative role. Now, of course, while their hands were tied officially by military policies, they would have most definitely, again, viewed Harvey Craven and other black cooks as equals and, again, allowed them the opportunity to fight. Lastly, while searching through other records in this rabbit hole of research, one of the other things that we found kind of interesting was a muster-out roll of the 11th Kansas Cavalry back at Fort Leavenworth later on that year. What was interesting about this is that the first 3 listings at the top of this page actually had the 3 black undercooks or cooks and undercooks, and all 3 of them were given the opportunity and chose to take the opportunity to buy their issue pistols for $8. Again, by itself, not that big of a deal. Were cooks issued weapons? Very much so. The 11th Kansas is not unique in this case. We've seen other records where other regiments gave their staff members, gave their cooks the ability to arm themselves, because if they were found on campaign with those soldiers, everyone else, and they had that kind of fight for survival, they would want weapons as well. But again, it's just another piece of evidence that when they were mustered out, number one, proof that they had these pistols, actually in one case a carbine, but they had these pistols issued to them. And number two, they were given the choice to purchase their issue pistol when they were mustered out, in which case they did. For $8, they took their issue pistol with them to their civilian life. So what does all this mean? Now I understand that the title of this video is a little clickbaity, but what I wanted to bring out is a story of Harvey Craven and show how looking at primary records from the research arsenal, state archives, and the National Archives can allow you to make discoveries that have not been written about or that little to no one knows about. And why does that matter? Is because those stories need to be told. So while I can't prove my premise fully, I can't help but piece together all of the evidence in which case that he wrote in these columns and these details whose only purpose was to chase Indians away from the fort in advance, which was known to turn into a running gun battle. He was involved enough and close enough in the famous Platte Bridge Station battle that he was severely wounded. So when you put all this evidence together, I must admit that it leans toward the fact that the 11th Kansas Cavalry might not have been an officially integrated regiment, of course they couldn't be, but it certainly functioned as one, at least to the extent possible, due to the abolitionists and the staunch free staters that were leading this regiment. And it's for that reason why I gotta appreciate the leadership of the 11th Kansas Cavalry and tell their story to more people. And I think this entire video came from a random research nook that we found. That was a note on the battlefield on July 26th. They found the next day on July 27th that Major Martin Anderson said, hey, there's a random note. He's a POW. We don't know who it is. And that struck me as odd. And we dove down the rabbit hole of primary research to find the story of Harvey Craven. And it's that primary document, the primary research that makes such a difference. If you want to support our mission and even investigate the other black members of the 11th Kansas Cavalry, go to theresearcharsenal.com now and become a member. Choose from a monthly or annual plan and gain access to the largest text searchable collection of Civil War letters on the internet. Search all the federal quarterly ordnance returns from your favorite regiments and search thousands of photos that are tagged with every single item in the photo to make it a little bit easier to find that one photo with that shell jacket, with a forage cap, with the Sharps carbine. And by doing so, you support our mission into digitizing more and more Civil War records so we all can have access to this and find our own historic discovery. Thank you so much for watching, and until we see you in the field next time, of course, ride hard.